I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Trump, Europe, Ukraine Meeting, Selling, Division of Labor, and Strategic Sequencing. And I know people are probably tired of me repeating this over and over again, but it is the truth. No matter how rapidly the rhetoric and the narrative in Washington changes, the underlying American agenda driving all of this remains unchanged. There is no evidence anyone can hold up and point to say the U.S. genuinely is changing course in terms of its foreign policy regarding the war in Ukraine it is waging against Russia by proxy, or anything else regarding American geopolitics anywhere else in the world. So, as always, I'm going to read through this article. We'll add additional information when and if necessary, and I will show you all of the articles that I used cited while writing this article. So let us begin. Following the recent meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, I already did a video about that. I will put the link in the video description below. And following the more recent meeting of European leaders, the Ukrainian president and President Trump in Washington, a predictable U.S. policy has begun to take shape. Painfully obvious. Everything that they were hinting at, proposing in Washington just this week is what U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out in February earlier this year. Yes, I'm going to go over that again. And this is February 12, 2025, opening remarks by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at Ukraine Defense Contact Group. He told the world publicly, this is on the Department of Defense's official website, the plan. This is what the U.S. is going to do. It is essentially Minsk 3.0. It is the freezing of the conflict. It is the moving of Western troops into Ukraine to ensure the conflict cannot restart, no matter how upset Russia is with the way this next upcoming U.S. betrayal of any agreement they make with Russia, no matter how bad that is. They will create a situation where they hope Russia cannot restart hostilities. They will pivot to China. He says this during these remarks. And then when they're done with China, they will circle back and deal with Russia later. They are pursuing American primacy over the entire planet. They're not interested in partnership, cooperation, constructive collaboration, none of this. They never have been, they aren't now, and they won't be anytime in the near future. So, as stated as early as February of this year by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, speaking to European leaders at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, Europe was tasked with taking over Washington's proxy war with Russia in Ukraine by ramping up NATO spending, arms production, and the transfer of material support to Ukraine, thus allowing the U.S. to pivot to the Asia-Pacific, prioritizing the containment of China there.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively.
Secretary Hegseth was clear that the conflict would be frozen, not ended. He said that it would be ended, but what he was describing was the freezing of the conflict. And that European and non-European troops, but not American troops, would be transferred into Ukraine to ensure a freeze, followed by Europe reorganizing and rebuilding Ukraine's armed forces. He said all of that in February, and then during this most recent meeting in Washington, European leaders, Ukraine's president, and President Trump, this is what they sat around a table and repeated. In some ways, almost verbatim. And then there were post-meeting interviews done with people like U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who also repeated all of these same things, almost verbatim. And I'm going to show you, before I go on, I'm going to show you this clip from an interview on Fox News with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. This is Secretary Rubio repeating the exact same justification for the expansion of NATO up to and all along Russia's borders that started this conflict in the first place. Let's listen.
So these European nations, and some of these are NATO countries, are they willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine to cement this peace deal? Would that make Ukraine kind of like a NATO ally?
Well, what's being contemplated, look, any sovereign country in the world has a right to enter into security alliances with other countries. You know, it's not just NATO. We have such alliances with South Korea. We have it with Japan. Other countries have it with each other. And so I think everyone would acknowledge, including, by the way, for the first time, the Russian side, under President Trump's sort of pressure or, a suggestion, is that, in fact, a Ukraine post-conflict has a right to enter into security agreements with other countries. And we will work with our European allies and non-European countries, by the way, to build such a security guarantee. We're working on that right now. We'll continue to work on that. And that'll be something that'll have to be in place after a peace deal so that Ukraine can feel safe moving forward.
This idea that any nation is allowed to join any security alliance that it wants and nobody else gets to have a say. And when he says that, he means Russia doesn't get to have a say. He is just repeating the entire mindset and agenda that triggered this war in the first place. So no, the Trump administration and the neocons that it's brimming to the top with have no intention of seeking any sort of actual peace with Russia. They want to freeze the conflict because it's collapsing. They want to freeze it. They want to keep Russia tied up in it. They want to pivot to China. They want to pivot toward other nations, confront them, contain them, set them back, and they will come back to this conflict later, just like they did with Syria. Successfully, I will add, and I've written about that in this article. As Secretary Hegseth explained, the reality of scarcity prevents the U.S., and that's what he literally said during the remarks, the reality of scarcity prevents the U.S. from engaging directly and fully in two great power conflicts with both Russia and China simultaneously, requiring the freezing of one conflict while the U.S. pursues the other. This was the essence of what Secretary Hegseth laid out in February, and it is what the U.S. is still attempting to achieve right now. Whether Russia allows them to or not is another story entirely. Please do not conflate the two. Explaining what the U.S. wants to do does not mean Russia is going to accept it. That remains to be seen. And as a matter of fact, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just after or around the time of this meeting in Washington, Russia rules out any scenarios deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. So we keep hearing this over and over again. Secretary Hegseth said it back in February. Everybody just repeated it at this meeting in Washington. And Russia is saying, no, that's not acceptable. We will not accept that. So that kind of gives us a little insight into where Russia is drawing red lines, or what those red lines consist of. The very fact the U.S. seeks to confront China in the Asia-Pacific in the same manner it has confronted Russia in Ukraine demonstrates a complete lack of interest in actual peace with either or any nation for that matter. The U.S. believes that if it can contain China sooner, it can circle back to confront and contain Russia later. People don't seem to grasp this. They are talking as if President Trump genuinely wants peace with Russia, even as they admit he's wrapping this up in Ukraine to go pursue the exact same type of conflict with China in the Asia-Pacific region. A nation that actually wants peace does not go looking for unprovoked conflict elsewhere around the globe. Again, on the other side of the planet from where it's actually located on a map. Strategic sequencing is not a term that I myself made up. It is a term that pops up in policy papers associated with the special interests that actually drive U.S. foreign policy and the Trump administration specifically. The Marathon Initiative is a subsidiary of these much larger think tanks. It is specifically tailored to copy and paste mainstream neocon globalist policy, if you will, copy and paste it into the specific Trump administration and then sell it as MAGA or America First. This is published in 2024. It's by Wes Mitchell. He's a former Trump administration official. And this is what it says. The idea of sequencing is simply to concentrate resources against one opponent in order to weaken its disruptive energies before turning to another, either to deter or defeat it. That is what the US is doing. That is the crux of what Secretary Hegseth laid out in February, and that is what the United States is attempting to do. Put a pin in the conflict in Ukraine for now, freeze, not end it, deal with China, come back and deal with Russia later. This is what they did all throughout the Cold War. They ran into a brick wall in one place, they put a pin in it, and they pursued and directed and diverted their resources elsewhere to continue the same singular agenda, global primacy, pursuing global primacy. Mitchell also used the term division of labor in regards to US allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, a term Secretary Hegseth would repeat verbatim in Brussels earlier this year. So this paper was published in 2024, and Secretary Hegseth was repeating almost verbatim entire parts of this paper earlier this year in 2025. That is how this works. Secretary Hegseth, President Trump, they're not coming up with this. They are simply getting handed these papers, and they are repeating what is on these papers to the public and to American client states, the leadership of US client states, for them to then implement. First principles, America's pursuit of primacy. First principles are so important whenever you're talking about anything that you're researching and trying to understand. You need to lay out first principles first. You have to understand the basic fundamental reality of what you are talking about, and then you build on top of that. So people who are trying to figure out what the Trump administration specifically is doing right now, but forgetting that the US has over a century of continuity of agenda behind it. The Trump administration itself has openly pursued continuity of agenda during its first term in office, and now just in the last couple of months of being in office. And they separate that reality, that fundamental reality, from their attempt to analyze the rhetoric of the day that President Trump is saying at a podium or on his Truth social media platform. So let's talk about the fundamentals. Let's understand the fundamentals of US geopolitical policy so that we can understand what all of this rhetoric actually means in the context of these fundamental realities. At the end of the Cold War, as the New York Times reported in its 1992 article, there are many articles like this. This isn't the only one, but for me, it's just the easiest one for people to share with people, for them to read and understand. There are policy papers and articles stacked to the ceiling that you could go through that repeat absolutely all of this. This is just one of the most convenient and concise examples that I can reference and include in my research to present to the public. So at the end of the Cold War, as the New York Times reported in its 1992 article, U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. That was the plan in 1992. That was the plan after World War II. That is the plan right now. President Trump labeling BRICS as some sort of threat. That is because the U.S., its plan, its singular agenda is primacy and ensuring no rivals develop, including BRICS as an alliance, and the BRICS members individually. The US sought to create, and this is a direct quote from the New York Times article, a world dominated by one superpower whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. They literally say American primacy. That was the goal then. That is the goal now. That has not changed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledging that there is something that exists called the multipolar world or the multipolar reality does not mean the United States accepts that or is interested in joining in on that. It is simply recognizing it as something that exists that is an impediment to American primacy. It is even mentioned in this article from 1992 that there is something like multipolarism that exists, that the US rejects, and its policies seek to overcome. And it says, the same article would note Washington's rejection of what they were calling at the time collective internationalism, referred to today as multipolarism. It's just a different term that means the exact same thing. Driving US ambitions to contain Russia and China, both in the 1990s and today, are not legitimate national security concerns. The US always says these nations are a threat to us and our interests. And when they say our interests, they mean things that exist outside of America's borders, oftentimes within the borders of other nations. So that's what I say. So they're actually driven to contain these nations for the preservation of US interests abroad, within and along the borders of both nations, Russia and China, in a manner the US itself would never tolerate another nation doing to it. So what the US is doing to the rest of the world, they would never tolerate any nation doing to it, which is how you know the United States itself, these special interests, know they're doing something wrong. They just don't care. It is might makes right in their mind. So that is one first principle that you need to build on top of. The US is still pursuing primacy. So everything stems from that. So if you are imagining, hallucinating developments in the White House, in Washington, in Brussels, in London, where somehow they are working contra to American primacy, then you have fallen off track. You're in the weeds. You are lost. You need to come back. You need to look at first principles, the fundamental reality, everything else is being built on top of, and you need to start again and see where that actually goes. If they are saying that they want to cooperate with Russia, we've heard this before. The US wants to cooperate with Russia, wants to reset its relationship with Russia. When it says these things, it doesn't mean them. Obviously, it is just saying it. It is rhetoric. It is propaganda. It is perception management. I will get to that in just a moment. Let's talk about the fundamental realities, the first principles regarding the conflict in Ukraine specifically. Ukraine is America's war and America's alone. It has pressed all of these other nations into serving its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. These other nations do not benefit from it. The reason these nations aid the United States in this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is because the US has installed client regimes in these nations. And in Europe's case, the European Union serves as a layer of bureaucracy that smothers the independent sovereignty of each member state of the European Union. These people work for Washington's interests at the expense of Europe. They're not thinking about Europe's best interests. They do not serve Europe's best interests. They're not pursuing Europe's best interests. On the contrary, they are trampling and burying and destroying their best interests. Regarding the war in Ukraine itself, despite recent comments by the Trump administration describing it as Biden's war, or claiming, and this was something President Trump recently said surrounding this meeting in Washington, President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately. How can he do that? He's in charge of nothing. He is in charge of nothing. He cannot. President Trump, the United States, could, because it's their war. They started it, they perpetuate it, they can stop it at any time of their choosing. If they wanted to. They're not, because they don't want to. The war is, in fact, a product of US foreign policy spanning multiple presidential administrations, including President Trump's first term in office. And of course, we know that because President Trump was the first US president publicly to start arming Ukraine, knowing full well that by arming Ukraine, you would be creating an escalating national security threat to Russia right on its border. And President Trump, to this day, still brags about doing this, even though some of his supporters try to claim he had bad advice. He didn't know who John Bolton or Mike Pompeo were. He was tricked into these policies, but even to this day, he brags about all of this. So either he shouldn't be president because he's incapable of independent, coherent thinking, or he's lying to you, one or the other. I'll let you guess which one. The U.S. currently commands Ukraine's armed forces. Yes, President Zelensky is not the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's military. Ukrainian generals are not commanding Ukraine's armed forces. It does not work like that in Ukraine. It works like this. The Partnership, the secret history of the war in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. They talk about a military base in Germany where U.S. commanders, not Ukrainian officers, make all of the decisions from theater-wide strategic planning to picking individual targets on the battlefield and striking at them with U.S. and European weapons transferred over to Ukraine. Ukraine's armed forces are beneath the United States in the chain of command through which this war is being waged against Russia in Ukraine. Since 2014, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency has assumed control and directs Ukraine's intelligence services, the New York Times also reported. This article from 2024, The Spy War, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin for more than a decade. So it wasn't since Russia began the special military operation. It was since the U.S. overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2014. The United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. The CIA directs, controls, trains, prepares everything Ukraine's intelligence agencies do. They talk about how the CIA has a network of bases all across Ukraine, including all along the border of Ukraine and Russia. This is the New York Times admitting to all of this, citing people in the US government who admit all of this. And all of it is plain for all to see. You can see that this is what is going on. You can see Ukraine getting attribution for military and intelligence operations. Obviously, only the US has the ability to carry out. Thus, the conflict in Ukraine can only be ended when the US decides to do so or is forced to do so by Russia. Those are the only two options. Anyone pretending otherwise either doesn't get it or they don't want you to get it. Understanding these basic first principles of U.S. foreign policy regarding the conflict in Ukraine is essential in successfully navigating the propaganda the U.S. and its client states are right now using to perform an attempted division of labor and strategic sequencing. That is their goal. They said publicly that is their goal. They need to move that into place. And they are using all kinds of rhetoric, propaganda, and theater to do so in whichever way they think they need to achieve this. But that is the goal, because these are the first principles. Number one, the U.S. pursues global primacy. Number two, the war in Ukraine was started by the U.S., it is perpetuated by the U.S., and it will only end when the U.S. decides to end it or Russia forces them to. They're not going to come to some sort of accommodation with Russia because, again, at the very base of all of this that we're building everything else on top of, the U.S. still pursues primacy, and making this concession to Russia would work contra to that. That's why they would never do it. Continuity of agenda under Trump, and this isn't me picking on President Trump. He is the president of the United States right now, so I'm going to pick on him, just like I picked on President Biden for 4 straight years, President Obama for 8 years straight, and President George Bush Jr. I picked on all of them. This is continuity of agenda. These presidents are presiding over it. They are playing their role in perpetuating this all, and I'm not going to give any of them a free pass. People come and see my work right now, and they just assume that I'm picking on Trump, so I must be a Democrat and support the Democrats. I have 4 years of work demonstrating otherwise. Since coming into office, the Trump administration itself has continued without exception, every conflict and confrontation inherited from the previous Biden administration in pursuit of global primacy, including the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, a confrontation with Iran, which then escalated to outright war just this past June, and the continued expansion of America's military footprint in the Asia-Pacific region along China's periphery, and even within its borders on the island province of Taiwan. People are saying Trump is serious about confronting China. Everything he is doing is built on things the Biden administration was setting up for 4 years straight. The reconfiguration of the US military to fight China specifically. The reconfiguration of the US Marine Corps itself to interdict maritime shipping. This is a core strategy the US is relying on to set up this confrontation with China and any conflict that breaks out with China as a consequence. Many other doctrine, strategies, weapon systems were all in the works under President Biden, the previous Trump administration, and 8 years of Obama. The pivot to Asia actually was announced under the Obama administration, and it has been incrementally built up ever since, and it is now reaching critical mass. America's policy regarding Russia specifically is described in detail in the 2019 Rand Corporation paper titled Extending Russia Competing from Advantageous Ground. People are probably sick of me showing you this, but this is the plan. This is a blueprint the US is using to guide policy regarding Russia. And everything that you see in here is essentially the same playbook the US is using against nations all over the globe. Iran, China. I've showed policy papers similar to this, but specifically about China or Iran. And anyone objectively looking at these measures, they will see these are all things the US has been doing. I've had people say to me, Brian, the Rand Corporation publishes papers that clearly, obviously aren't being implemented. You have to understand what a think tank is and how it works. A think tank will publish a paper like this, and you can see with your own eyes, demonstratively so, this is a blueprint that the US is using. This isn't actually the blueprint. It is describing consensus that has already been arrived at within the special interests driving US foreign and domestic policy. There are other policy papers that are just busy work. In some cases, they write policy papers specifically for the Western media to pick up as part of perception management. We have to look at where the paper came from and what it is talking about to determine whether or not it is a blueprint, a brainstorm, or just outright propaganda. There are a wide variety of reasons think tanks publish papers, and it's not always a blueprint. It takes discernment, which is what I try to share with the public. I try to explain why this is a blueprint and why some other paper might not be. And so it's not a, I gotcha, I found a Rand Corporation paper that's not being implemented. It's like going into an engineer's office and he has some doodles on a napkin of something that he never built. And then he's got a stack of papers up to the ceiling about a shopping center he is already in the middle of constructing. One is a blueprint, one is a brainstorm. Use some discernment to figure out which is which. So let's talk about the Rand Corporation's paper, literally titled Extending Russia. The paper lists economic measures, including hinder petroleum exports, which it has been doing and is still doing, reduce natural gas exports and hinder pipeline expansions, has done, is doing. It literally blew up the Nord Stream pipelines as part of this, and impose sanctions. It has been doing it, it is doing it. The Trump administration itself is threatening more sanctions, secondary sanctions as well. Measures that had been pursued by the US at the time the paper was published and ever since, including under the first Trump administration, the subsequent Biden administration, now during President Trump's second term in office. Geopolitical measures listed by the Rand paper included provide lethal aid to Ukraine, which I just showed you began under the first Trump administration. Increase support to the Syrian rebels, which manifested itself late last year in the successful US overthrow of the Syrian government. Promote regime change in Belarus, which Russia has so far neutralized. I found this interesting, Chatham House, another think tank, Western think tank, this one in the UK, why the Belarusian revolution has stalled. And they're complaining about how their attempt to carry out regime change in Belarus the same way they did in Ukraine has failed. And they're trying to figure out what they can do, if anything, to get it going again. And Russia saw what happened to Ukraine in 2014, and they took drastic measures to prevent it from happening to both Belarus, and if people remember, in early 2022, before the special military operation began, Russia actually deployed military troops to Kazakhstan to stop US regime change there, to stabilize the country. And then those troops returned, and then the special military operation was launched the next month. So the Russians successfully so far have neutralized that. There's also exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, which is unfolding currently under the Trump administration in the form of a 99-year lease on territory, potentially placing US troops along both Russia's and Iran's border. And I've got a Guardian article here talking about Iran and Russia stand to lose from US deal with Azerbaijan and Armenia. This is literally the Trump administration still checking off the boxes of this 2019 Rand Corporation paper. They're doing all of this even as they pretend to seek peace in Ukraine. They're not seeking peace. They're seeking a pause. They're putting the pressure on Russia everywhere else. They're going to try to engineer this pause in Ukraine in such a way that it does not free up significant amounts of Russian resources. They want to keep Russia tied down while they dismember its allies, isolate it further, and then come back and dismantle it last. Together, these policies represent a continued attempt by the US to encircle, contain, undermine, and overextend the Russian Federation, ultimately seeking to precipitate a Soviet Union-style collapse, even as the US feigns interest in peace with Russia in Ukraine, which is basically what I just said. And so, as in the past, so in the future, there are many, many examples. I've done entire videos where I've talked about the cycle of US confrontation with Russia, reaching a brick wall, offering peace or a pause or a reset, making all kinds of deals, and then breaking them and starting the whole process all over again. That is all that they have done all throughout their relationship with the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, without exception. There's not even a single exception to any of this. Regardless of setbacks and limitations, as long as the US continues pursuing primacy, as long as that is their central objective over the nations of the globe, rather than constructive cooperation with them, any US overture of peace with nations it has labeled adversaries and threats represents an established pattern of pausing, reorganizing, rearming, and reinitiating hostilities, not any genuine shift in policy. Again, the Trump administration just in the last 8 months has done this to other countries, and it is doing it to Russia. The most recent example of this was the US regime change war waged in Syria. Following Russia's intervention in 2015, the war was brought to a pause. The US used this pause to rearm and reorganize its proxies in and around Syria, while Syria's allies, Russia and Iran, were drawn into a series of costly conflicts elsewhere. Once Russia and Iran were sufficiently overextended, the US reinitiated fighting in late 2024, quickly and successfully overthrowing the Syrian government. And then President Trump came in, shook hands with the terrorists the US installed into power, and his administration delisted al-Qaeda in Syria as a terrorist organization so that they can more openly and to a greater extent back them and use Syria as a springboard to finish burning down the rest of the region, isolating Iran even further, and eventually, they hope, topple the government in Iran. And of course, the US has already, under the Trump administration, waged war against Iran directly. The collapse of Syria was followed by US-Israeli military operations carried out against Iran itself, combined with a still ongoing push to eliminate what is left of Iran's allies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. And again, there's another policy paper by the Brookings Institution from all the way back in 2009 that said you need to take out Syria first before you start a war with Iran because of airspace and the realities of carrying out an air campaign against Iran. You need an air corridor. Collapse Syria, use it as an air corridor to attack Iran. Then that was 2009, over 16 years ago, and that is literally verbatim what they just carried out at the very end of the Biden administration and this first half year plus of the Trump administration. So people who dismiss these policy papers do so at their own expense. A pause in Washington's proxy war on Russia and Ukraine will simply see US efforts shift elsewhere. Just as Secretary Hegseth said in February, we need to pause this because we need to carry out death and destruction, destabilization elsewhere. We'll come back to this later. As Secretary Hegseth laid out in February, any pause would be accompanied by European troops, also non-European troops, but not American troops, occupying Ukraine, just as the US and Turkey occupied Syria. It would also include the rearming and reorganizing of Ukraine's military. As that was just mentioned, just during this meeting in Washington, Trump promised Ukraine security guarantees. Here's what they could look like. And throughout this article, they're talking about billions and billions of dollars of arms to rebuild, rearm, reorganize Ukraine's armed forces, which is what they did. That's what they used Minsk 1 and 2 to do. And that is what they are openly preparing to do again. That is why it's Minsk 3.0, even if they swear it isn't. Of course, they're lying. Obviously, it is. It's Minsk 3.0. And this was mentioned specifically during the recent US-European-Ukrainian meeting in Washington and the reinitiation of hostilities at a later time when factors leaned back in Washington's favor, just like in Syria. That war was frozen for years, and as soon as the US had an opportunity, they restarted it, and they collapsed the entire Syrian nation state. No longer exists in any meaningful way. Not only is this what Secretary Hegseth's statements regarding a division of labor and strategic sequencing imply, it is what the US has done all throughout the Cold War and ever since. During the Bush Jr. administration, it's admitted, again, this article, an explicit admission of the US government's involvement in attempting to overthrow and overthrowing multiple nations in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. Attempted to overthrow, this was 2004, they attempted to overthrow Belarus, they successfully overthrew Serbia, they successfully overthrew Georgia in 2003, and in 2004 they were making an attempt that ultimately failed at that time to overthrow the Ukrainian government, but then of course they succeeded in 2014. They admit that the US was doing that. It was admitted that the US pursued regime change in several Eastern European nations as well as Georgia and the Caucasus region. In 2003, the US successfully overthrew the Georgian government, just as it did the Ukrainian government in 2014. Just as it did in Ukraine, the US began reorganizing and building up Georgia's military, and in 2008, as the EU investigation concluded, this one here, Georgia started a war with Russia, and the EU, that was their conclusion. They started a war with Russia. The US told them to. They started a war with Russia. They lost the war. The US hit a brick wall. They wanted to know whether or not Russia would react militarily and to what extent, and Russia reacted militarily and to a great extent. And so they hit a brick wall, and they needed to reset their relationship with Russia to buy time and space to set the next trap, the next provocation. So the next year, under the Obama administration, the US sought a reset. This is US government-funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The website is still up and running, despite everyone believing it was dismantled and defunded. After meeting, Russian Foreign Minister Clinton hails fresh start. And they had a literal physical prop of a reset button that Secretary of State at that time, Hillary Clinton, handed to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And they were all smiling, and Secretary Clinton was talking about this new dawn in US-Russian relations, just like we hear the Trump administration doing. That's all they're doing. They're doing that again. There is no evidence of any genuine interest in peace or cooperation with Russia. Zero. None. Just like there was none when Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, performed this theater in 2009. In reality, the US simply sought time and space to prepare the next series of provocations, which it did, and it did under the Obama administration, which performed this theater in 2009 as part of this reset. They performed this theater, and then from 2011 onward, they divided and destroyed much of the Arab world. That was the Arab Spring, US-engineered regime change across an entire region of the planet, targeting Russian allies, including Libya and Syria. Libya and Syria are now erased as functioning nation states. The leader of Libya was murdered by US proxies, armed and backed proxies, and Syria's leader fled to Russia. And the aforementioned successful toppling of the Ukraine government in 2014, that also took place under the back-to-back Obama administrations, along with the US pivot to Asia, which began under the Obama administration and continues to this day, uninterrupted, regardless of who is in power. Obama, Trump, Biden, doesn't matter. It all continues in a singular direction without deviation. The only thing that changes is the rhetoric and the excuses as to why nothing is changing. Not only do recent US policies appear to represent just the latest in this cycle of posing as seeking peace while preparing the next series of confrontations, the US has all but said freezing the conflict in Ukraine is meant to give the US time and space to prioritize containing China first, with the implication being the US will return to antagonize Russia in Ukraine afterwards. Only time will tell to what degree Russia accommodates or disrupts attempts by the US to implement a division of labor regarding Ukraine, to perform a process of strategic sequencing to defeat Russia, China, and their allies in detail. That means fighting them, knocking them off one at a time instead of fighting them all at once. And whether or not the rest of the multipolar world will unite sufficiently to aid Russia or allow themselves to be divided and distracted by similar US efforts to disrupt and destabilize their respective nations. The US does this to all nations, not just Russia and China or Iran. Russia's calculus will be based on either its confidence in continuing the special military operation to its full conclusion, which means collapsing Ukraine's military and removing the US-installed client regime placed in Kiev in 2014 onward, or the necessity to agree to a pause Moscow feels it can make better use of than the collective West and face off against the US and its proxies in the future from an even stronger position. We have to remember, Russia is not just looking at the situation in Ukraine. It's looking at US pressure along its entire periphery. It is also looking at US pressure on all of its allies and partners. There has to be a coordinated effort among all of these nations because the US is targeting them all with its own coordinated action. It may be that Russia seeks to free up resources for its own pivot to aid allies like Iran and China as the US itself turns its attention further east. Unlike the US, however, Russia lacks the long list of client states it can enlist to mind one conflict while pivoting to the other, as Washington can and is doing right now. That's what they're doing. The future of the multipolar world may depend as much on aiding nations in preventing their political capture and exploitation by the US as it does on multipolar nations cooperating with one another as they defend themselves against US encroachment, coercion, and capture. I constantly bring up the most dangerous US superweapon of all. It's not any sort of military weapon. It is their ability to politically capture a country, to use the National Endowment for Democracy, which still exists, still funded, still used by the current administration as it has by all previous administrations, to interfere in targeted nations, build up an opposition movement, and then install it into power, short-circuiting the best interests of that country, using its control over information space to convince the public that serving US interests are their own best interests, even when in reality it will collectively lead the country off of a cliff, just as Ukraine is doing right now, just as many countries politically captured and then used by the US as proxies have done over the years. The ultimate test for Russia and the emerging multipolar world lies not just in their ability to endure US designs aimed at each of them individually, but in their capacity to turn this strategy back against Washington. If Russia can conclude its SMO in Ukraine decisively, while simultaneously strengthening its alliances with nations like China and Iran, it can render the division of labor useless. Similarly, if China can use this period to solidify its regional influence and deepen its ties with nations outside the collective West, across the multipolar world, the US will find its pivot to the Asia-Pacific far less effective. The current geopolitical landscape is a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess. It is the multipolar world versus the US-dominated unipolar world. And while the US believes it can corner its rivals one by one, a coordinated checkmate from the multipolar world could end the game for good. Success means a world defined by peace, stability, and prosperity amid a global balance of power, no one single nation dominating the others. Failure means forfeiting all of our collective future. It doesn't matter where you live. If you are in the United States, you are forfeiting your future to these special interests in the US who have already demonstrated for a century the means and desire to destroy it, to destroy a collective future. Americans are not gaining anything by any of this. They have consistently and increasingly suffered because of this. They are among the first victims of US empire. The US is taking national resources and investing it in empire rather than investing it in the best interests of the American people, which manifests itself, the actual best interests of a nation manifest themselves in infrastructure, education, healthcare, maintaining reasonable cost of living, access to housing, all of these things. All of these things Americans are constantly complaining about. All of these things people voted President Trump into office to fix. Things that he's not fixing, openly not fixing, actually making much worse with the tariffs. And what are the tariffs? Everyone was told the tariffs were to reindustrialize the United States. The U.S. has no plan to reindustrialize the U.S. To do that, you need to have a massive, sweeping campaign to reorganize education and industry. The U.S. is not even talking about doing that. The tariffs are for coercing nations abroad, for preserving and expanding American hegemony abroad, which benefits a small handful of special interests in the U.S. The tariffs, of course, are not paid by the nations targeted by them, not directly. It targets the American consumer. They are the victims of U.S. tariffs. They're the ones that pay the difference. And the way it harms targeted nations is that people are unable to pay for these products, so they have to cut back on exports, which then means less revenue for them ultimately. That's how all of that works. And so that is the article. That is the article. That is where we are. Again, it's very tempting, and these narratives are designed specifically to tempt you into them, to play on your whatever your partisan political proclivities might be, to play on them, to get you roped into these fights between left and right and this and that, and to ignore the fundamental reality of U.S. foreign and domestic policy, who actually controls it and why, and what they're doing, and how unrealistic a lot of these things each presidential administration proposes to the public. Do you remember President Biden's Build Back Better, the answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative? What happened with that? Before that, it was the Blue Dot Initiative. I think I would have to look that up. The Blue Dot, it doesn't matter because it also never materialized. And now President Trump has his own empty promise. He's offering Americans to dupe them into continuing to support continuity of agenda. He's selling continuity of agenda as MAGA and America First. And he's making good on none of these promises. He tells you the border is doing better. And if you're a Trump supporter, where are you getting your media? You're getting your media for people who are just going to repeat whatever the Trump administration says. Have you actually independently checked to see if the situation at the border actually is better? That there are no more people illegally entering the country? Has President Trump even talked about the source of why people are entering the country? U.S. interference across all of Latin America? Or is he continuing to interfere all across Latin America, almost certainly causing more people to try to flee to the United States? This is U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, arch neocon. I honestly cannot understand why people insist that he's not a neo. He is one of the worst neocons alive and still in politics in Washington today. This is what he just posted. This is at the top of his timeline on X right now. Wanted, reward increase of up to $50 million US. This is the president of Venezuela, and they're accusing him of narco terrorism conspiracy. And this is just a continuation of regime change in Venezuela that has spanned the Bush Jr. administration, 8 years of Obama, the last 4 years of the Trump administration, all 4 years of the Biden administration, and now it continues under the Trump administration. A government that is doing this to Venezuela and Latin America, do you honestly believe that it is capable or in any shape, form, or way desires peace with Russia? Even as it openly says that it needs to put a pin in Ukraine so that it can fight the exact same war against China in the Asia Pacific? And the answer is no. That is a fundamental reality that people are blocking out to indulge in their own pet political proclivities. That the US and Europe, collective West, created in the first place to divide, distract, and manipulate you. That is where we are right now. That is what the United States is doing. That's what it has said it was going to do. That is what it is openly doing, regardless of whatever the rhetoric is that it is using and how people are trying to interpret it. That is where we are, and that is where this is headed. We have to, with that in mind, we have to keep a close eye on this and see what the Russians do or don't do as the U.S. tries to push Minsk 3.0 forward as predicted. I will keep an eye on this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Check the video description below for all of the other places you can find and follow my work. All of the links that are referenced in this video are in the video description below, as is the article, the link to the article that I had just read that I wrote and I am sharing with you in case you don't like reading articles or don't have time to or want additional information about. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Those links will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare, please do not apologize. Just sharing my work with others is also greatly appreciated. All of that adds up and helps make this work possible. So thank you, all of you, who are helping in whichever way you can. And as always, thank you for watching.